Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. Cleopatra VII, 1st century BC. The Seductive Strategist. The Nile was not just a river, it was the spine of a civilization, a ribbon of life winding through the arid bones of Egypt. In the 1st century before Christ, it shimmered beneath a punishing sun, its waters sluggish with silt, secrets and the weight of empires. Crocodiles lay half-submerged at its banks. Fishermen pulled papyrus rafts through the reeds. And in the distance, the white walls of Alexandria glittered like a mirage. A Hellenistic city perched at the edge of Africa, drunk on beauty and politics, swollen with ambition. It was here, in a palace overlooking the harbour's turquoise sprawl, that a girl, just a girl, was being sculpted into legend. She would become known to the world as Cleopatra. But first, she had to survive her family. The Ptolemies were not like other dynasties. They did not marry to forge alliances. They married their siblings. They did not rule as servants of the gods. They were gods, in their own eyes at least. Their tongues spoke Greek. Their statues mimicked Athens, but they wore the crowns of pharaohs and governed Egypt like a private inheritance. Cleopatra VII was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Macedonian Greek royal house established in Egypt after the conquests of Alexander the Great. Her family ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, and throughout that time they married almost exclusively within their own bloodline to preserve their Hellenistic heritage. Cleopatra herself was almost certainly of predominantly Greek descent, and possibly the first in her line to even speak Egyptian fluently. Despite being Queen of Egypt, she was not ethnically Egyptian or black African. A misconception that persists today, often fueled by modern reinterpretations. Historically, she was a Greek-speaking monarch, raised in the intellectual traditions of the Hellenistic world. By the time Cleopatra VII was born, likely in 69 BC, the Ptolemaic line had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. It was a kingdom of wealth, decadence, and decline. Rome was circling. Cleopatra's earliest memories would have been steeped in grandeur and fear. Marble floors slick with oils, gold filigree on every surface, hallways that echoed with the whispers of eunuchs and spies. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known mockingly as Orleats, the flute player, was a weak and anxious king, more interested in Greek music than governing. His reign was marked by bribes, Roman debts, and the growing realization that Egypt's independence was paper-thin. And yet, from an early age, Cleopatra stood apart, not just because she was intelligent, though she was razor-sharp, not just because she was beautiful, though her allure would one day become the stuff of obsession. No. Cleopatra was different because she listened. Unlike her siblings, she did not sneer at the Egyptian priests or mock the native tongue. She learned it. She studied hieroglyphs, studied law, studied astronomy, medicine, mathematics. She memorized Homer and Herodotus. She read the sacred scrolls of Isis by candlelight, lips barely moving, eyes burning with focus. While her brothers squabbled over toys and flattered courtiers, Cleopatra listened to the wind coming in off the desert. She watched the shadows stretch across the city's obelisks. She understood, long before her coronation, that survival in Egypt required something more than bloodlines. It required strategy and charm. The first true test of that strategy came in her late teens. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had been exiled, ousted by a furious Alexandrian mob, and replaced by Cleopatra's older sister, Berenice IV. In Rome, he begged senators to restore him, pledging Egyptian treasure to finance their campaigns. Cleopatra went with him, seeing the power behind the world's new masters. She saw Pompey Magnus speak in the Forum. She watched Caesar rise, steel-eyed, inscrutable, feared. She learned who held the reins of history. When her father was finally restored to the throne with Roman aid, Berenice was executed, her loyalists butchered, and Cleopatra had taken careful notes. The moment he died, Ptolemy XII's will decreed a dual rule between Cleopatra and her younger brother, a boy named Ptolemy XIII, only around 10 years old. They would be married, as was tradition, in the Great Hall of Alexandria's royal palace. The Great Hall was a cavernous chamber steeped in ceremony and symbolism, a convergence of Hellenistic opulence and ancient Egyptian mysticism. Massive columns loomed skyward, carved in hybrid styles that merged papyrus motifs with Corinthian flourishes, their surfaces inlaid with gold leaf and hieroglyphic dedications to Isis and Osiris. Polished alabaster tiles reflected the flickering light of suspended oil lamps, casting long, restless shadows across the ornate friezes that lined the walls. Scenes of divine union, conquest, and celestial legitimacy. At the far end stood twin thrones, raised on a dais of black granite, beneath a painted ceiling depicting Nut, the sky goddess, arching protectively over the scene. It was a hall built not just for rulership, but for theatre, a place where power could be staged, sanctified and sealed. On this particular day, another irrevocable moment of Egyptian history would be made in this place, and the marble floors of the great hall glowed gold in the low Egyptian sun, polished to a mirror sheen. Incense coiled through the colonnades, thick with myrrh and frankincense, meant to honour the gods, or perhaps to mask the rot of politics. Musicians played a mournful procession in soft, deliberate tones, not triumphant, not joyful, but measured, cautious, and at the centre of it all stood a girl. Cleopatra, 14 years old, draped in ceremonial white, jewelled, perfumed, radiant, and utterly alone. To her left, a child no older than 10, her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. He shifted in his robes, uncomfortable under the weight of a crown that was too large, too soon. His eyes scanned the crowd, seeking approval, instruction, or perhaps an escape. He found none. The high priest of Ptah intoned the sacred vows, a fusion of Greek tradition and Egyptian divinity, invoking Isis and Osiris, Zeus and Hera, in one strange breath. The crowd bowed their heads, but none smiled. This was not a wedding. It was a coronation veiled as matrimony, a transaction inked in bloodline. Cleopatra turned toward her brother as instructed. Their hands were bound with silk. Gold was poured between their fingers. The crowns, twin circlets of laurel and cobra, were lowered onto their heads in perfect synchrony. He fidgeted. She did not. She held still, chin high, shoulders drawn back like the wings of a falcon. She had seen what this meant, not just for her throne, but for her soul. There would be no love here, no protection, only masks, only manoeuvres. She would not be a wife, nor even a sister. She would be a ruler, and to rule in this family meant being ready to kill. As the hall erupted in applause, shallow, practiced, ritualistic, Cleopatra's eyes drifted upward, past the torches, past the arches, to the shadowed ceiling of painted stars. She wondered if the real gods were watching, and if they were they laughing or weeping? Behind the boy king stood a ruthless cabal of advisers, ambitious men like the eunuch Pothinus, who saw Cleopatra's intelligence as dangerous. Theirs was a vision of Egypt as a puppet kingdom, pliable to Rome and to their own ambitions. But Cleopatra? Cleopatra wanted more. At first, she played the game. She shared coinage with her brother's face. She issued joint decrees. But within a year, her name alone was on official documents. She stood alone at public ceremonies. Her image, not his, adorned the statues of Thebes and Memphis. The knives came out quickly. By 48 BC, she was exiled, driven from Alexandria by force. She fled eastward to the desert with a small loyal force, gathering troops in Syria, preparing for civil war. And then, fate turned. Rome's shadow fell once again over Egypt, this time not as an ally, but as an invader. Julius Caesar had arrived. The Alexandrian civil war had drawn Rome's attention. Pompey Magnus, Caesar's great rival, fled to Egypt after losing the Battle of Pharsalus. He sought refuge. All he got was a dagger. On the shores of Pelusium, Roman soldiers watched in horror as Pompey was betrayed, murdered on landing by Egyptian agents eager to impress Caesar. His severed head was delivered, still bleeding, to the great general, but Caesar did not smile. He turned away, silent, disgusted. He had not come for vengeance. He had come to reshape the world. And Cleopatra saw her opening. The scene that followed would become the stuff of myth. Caesar was ensconced in the royal palace. Alexandria, restless, suspicious, eyed the old Roman with contempt. He demanded repayment of debts, demanded stability. But then, one night, a large rolled rug, thick, richly woven, scented with lavender and Nile rush, was brought into his chamber. A gift, a curiosity, delivered by a Greek merchant with trembling hands, carried by 2 Egyptian servants, and accompanied by a eunuch guide. The palace was quiet at that hour, quiet in that particular way powerful places become when danger coils just beneath the surface. Outside, Alexandria simmered with unrest. Inside, the marble halls whispered with tension. Caesar sat in a great chamber, open to the breeze, draped in Roman austerity. Pillars rose like sentinels around him. Torches hissed against the evening air, and beside his chair, scrolls lay half-read, war maps unrolled, missives from Rome unopened. He was not expecting a queen, he was expecting a problem. "A gift," said the eunuch guide, bowing low. "From the Queen of Egypt, Julius." Caesar barely looked up. He gestured impatiently. They laid it gently before him, and as they stepped back, the rug stirred. For a moment, nothing. Then fingers emerged, delicate and precise, parting the folds. And Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, daughter of the Ptolemies, exiled but undefeated, rose like smoke from the silken cocoon. She did not rush. She unfurled. Her hair, dark as obsidian, tumbled across bare shoulders dusted with gold. A single pendant hung between her breasts, an emerald in the shape of a scarab. Her skin shimmered in the lamplight, not painted with excess, but radiant with the gleam of jasmine oil. She looked up at him, slow, unblinking. A smile played at the corner of her lips, curious, unthreatened, amused. "Forgive the entrance," she said, voice low and melodic. The gates were unfriendly. Caesar stood. His expression, the iron calm of a 57-year-old man who had seen empires fall, faltered. She moved toward him, just 21 years old, barefoot on cold marble, the hem of her gown whispering like secrets. She did not avert her gaze, did not apologize, did not beg. She was younger than he'd expected, and far more dangerous. He studied her, the lift of her chin, the precision in her movements, not a girl, a woman of fire, a presence, a force. "You risk a great deal," he said. She stepped closer. "As do you," she replied. by believing the world is only what it appears to be. Silence stretched between them, thick, electric. Her perfume, spiced honey and desert wind, filled the space like a drug. But there was nothing submissive in her posture, no coquettish fawning. She stood like a monarch, and looked at him not as a saviour, but as a tool. And yet there was softness there too, a flicker behind the eyes. She had come not just to survive, but to win, to rise. And that required a performance, one she delivered with devastating grace. They spoke for hours, of Egypt, of Rome, of power, of gods, of love in the abstract, and the cold calculus beneath it. She sat beside him, not across from him. She touched his wrist when she disagreed, laughed once, lightly, musically, when he mispronounced an Egyptian word, and corrected him, gently. He found himself listening and forgetting, just for a moment, the weight of the purple cloak at his shoulders. By dawn, Alexandria would wake to a different reality. Cleopatra was no longer a fugitive. She was in the palace, and the world's most powerful man was already thinking in terms of we. Within days, the palace was in uproar. Caesar declared Cleopatra co-ruler, his decision delivered with imperial finality. Her brother's forces reacted with fury, besieging the palace with their Egyptian army. The city ignited. Stones shattered windows. Arrows clattered from rooftops. Alexandria, city of scholars and merchants, was now a war zone. Caesar, trapped within its walls, summoned reinforcements from across the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, Cleopatra stood at the window of her chamber, staring out at her burning capital, her hand resting gently on her abdomen. Some say she was already pregnant, with Caesar's child. The siege of Alexandria raged for months. Streets turned to ash. The harbour ran red. The great library, that jewel of ancient knowledge, suffered a catastrophic blaze. Scrolls smouldered. Centuries of wisdom lost to heat and smoke. And through it all, Cleopatra remained by Caesar's side. Not as a hostage or a lover, but as a co-commander. She walked the hallways barefoot, listening for tremors beneath the marble. She gave orders in Greek and Egyptian. She soothed wounded soldiers and whispered into Caesar's ear as his temper flared. The Roman general had never known a woman like her, and yet the siege was not won by seduction. It was won by fire, by Roman steel, in a moment when the wind of fate shifted. At first it was nothing, a subtle change in the briny breath of the harbour, barely noticed amidst the reek of smoke, blood and rotting fish. But then came the sound. Not thunder, not drums. It was the thrum of oars. Dozens, then hundreds. A pulsing rhythm that rolled across the sea like the beating of a great ancient heart. From the western horizon, sails appeared, sharp against the glare of the midday sun, snapping with Roman insignia, hulls painted red and black, bristling with soldiers. Legionaries packed the decks like scales on a serpent. Sunlight glinted off pylons, off helmets, off drawn blades eager for release. Caesar's reinforcements had arrived, and Alexandria would burn anew. Inside the city, the siege had twisted into desperation. Ptolemy XIII's forces, emboldened by months of pressure, had choked the palace district, pushing Caesar's dwindling garrison into narrow quarters. Streets had become battlegrounds of oil and flame. Roofs were used for archers. The cisterns were poisoned. Cleopatra, veiled and barefoot, moved silently through the upper halls of the palace, whispering orders to her loyalists, comforting the wounded, the dying, and the terrified. Outside, Roman bodies lay strewn in courtyards, where they had fought to the last. The great library smouldered still, scrolls curling into ash, philosophy devoured by blind, hungry fire. But the tide now turned. The first clash came at the harbour walls. The Alexandrian defenders, Egyptian archers, Greek mercenaries, desperate conscripts, rushed to hold the docks. They loosed arrows into the advancing Roman ships, blackening the sky with feathered death. But the Romans didn't flinch. The Roman soldiers who arrived to break the siege of Alexandria were no conscripts. They were hardened legionaries, veterans of Caesar's brutal campaigns in Gaul, Britain, and the Civil War. Disciplined, efficient, and utterly lethal, they fought not for coin or glory, but for him. Their loyalty to Caesar was forged in blood and fire, in freezing mountain passes and river crossings, in fields littered with the dead. They moved as one, shields locked, eyes cold, blades sharp. To their enemies they were not men, but machines of war, trained to kill without hesitation and die without complaint. And when they landed on Egyptian soil, they did so with a singular purpose: to find their general and to annihilate anyone who had dared trap him. With military precision, the first wave of legionaries launched grappling lines and surged over the stone wharves. They fought in formation, shields locked, blades low. There were no grand speeches, no mercy. They cut. Guttural screams echoed off the stone. The surf turned crimson. Then came the fire ships. Caesar, ever the tactician, had ordered them into position. Older vessels packed with pitch, oil and kindling, set ablaze and driven into the Alexandrian fleet. One after another, they struck the anchored ships of Ptolemy's navy. The impact was thunderous. Masts snapped like bones. Fire erupted skyward, blue, yellow, orange, licking at the sails before devouring them whole. Men dove overboard, clothes aflame. Horses shrieked from the lower holds as the decks buckled and collapsed. By dusk, the harbour was a graveyard of smoke and boiling tar. Inside the city, chaos fractured the defenders' ranks. As word spread of the fleet's destruction, morale collapsed. Pothinus, the eunuch regent, vanished into the alleys, only to be found later, strangled and gutted, a warning left to rot outside the Serapeum. Ptolemy XIII, still only a boy, tried to rally his remaining forces near the Nile's edge. He failed, and the line broke. Pressed by the reinforcements from behind, and Caesar's inner guard from the palace, the defenders were forced into retreat, backs against the black water, hemmed in by stone and spear. Ptolemy, panicked and desperate, attempted escape by boat. But the vessel, weighed down with treasure and trembling courtiers, listed and capsized mid-river. The boy king drowned. His gilded armour dragged him into the depths, his cries going unheard in the chaos. He was just 13. Cleopatra stood atop the palace steps, her elegant silhouette outlined by the last light of the burning harbour. The wind whipped her robes around her legs. Her eyes, wide, unblinking, watched the city crumble. It was not victory she wore on her face. It was calculation. Ptolemy was dead. Caesar had won, and so had she, not with swords, not with ships, but with survival, with the quiet art of waiting, and striking when the world was at its weakest. Cleopatra, now undisputed Queen of Egypt, stood silent as her brother's body was dragged from the river. There were no tears. There was no triumph. Only the knowledge that power, true power, always comes at a price. And hers was only just beginning. The Nile rolled on, silent, wide, implacable, and as it flowed it carried not only silt and songbirds and drifting papyrus, but the weight of an empire reborn. Cleopatra was queen, but not in the way her ancestors had ruled. She was not a figurehead, draped in ceremony. She was not a mother-sister wife, stitched into royal lineage for stability. She ruled with intent, with presence, with strategy so entwined with sensuality that her enemies never knew whether they were being seduced or conquered. And by her side, for a moment, was Rome, or at least one Roman. Caesar lingered in Egypt longer than expected. 9 months passed. By the time he sailed from Alexandria, he left behind a stabilized kingdom and a child. Caesarion, they named him. Ptolemy XV, but few called him that. To his mother he was a bridge, a claim, a gamble on legitimacy. To Rome he was an embarrassment, a rumour just that little bit too close to power. And to Cleopatra he was protection, a living bond between her kingdom and Caesar's ambition. She followed him to Rome the next year. Not in secret, not in exile, she arrived as a queen. Cleopatra swept through the streets of the capital with an entourage of musicians, philosophers, and eunuchs. She arrived on a barge lined with scented wood, dressed in silks dyed Tyrian purple, skin perfumed with myrrh, eyes lined with crushed malachite flashing in the sun. Romans gawked, some whispered in admiration, others in scandal. They called her the Eastern Whore, the sorceress, the Queen of the Nile, the siren who'd coiled herself around Caesar's will. But no one looked away, not even the Senate. In public, Caesar honoured her cautiously. He lodged her across the Tiber, not within the city walls, lest it offend tradition. But he visited her often, spoke to her in hushed Latin, asked questions, listened, laughed. She was the only woman who dared to argue with him, not with outrage but with elegance. She challenged his logic, matched his metaphors, played the Game of Thrones like it was a duet, and he, dictator, general, visionary, found himself ensnared. There were whispers, again, that he might name her Queen of Rome, that Caesarion might be named his heir. The Senate's knuckles whitened, and the knives were sharpened. The Ides of March came, and so did the steel. The Senate chamber was heavy with silence, the kind that thickens just before the strike. Caesar entered the theatre of Pompeii in his flowing white toga, laurel wreath glinting in the morning light. He climbed the marble steps slowly, unaware or unwilling to believe what had already been set in motion around him. The senators closed in. Dozens, familiar faces, trusted men. And then, without a word, the first blade. It sliced into his shoulder, shallow but shocking. He spun, eyes wide, as the others followed. Steel flashed, fabric tore, blood sprayed across the polished stone. He staggered backwards, reaching, pleading. But they surrounded him like wolves. Blades punched into his ribs, his stomach, his legs. He fell to one knee. And then came Brutus, his friend, his son in all but blood. Their eyes met, just for a heartbeat, before the final thrust. A wet gasp escaped Caesar's lips. He slumped forward, cloak soaked scarlet collapsing beneath the statue of Pompey, the man he had once destroyed. And there, in the shadow of triumphs past, Julius Caesar died. Cleopatra, in her villa, watched a slave run toward her through the lemon trees, face pale, voice trembling, carrying news that would shatter the dream. Caesar was dead. The link had broken. And Rome was now a hydra with 1,000 snapping heads. She fled. Back to Alexandria. Back to her palace, her temples, her ships. And though she mourned him, the Roman who had helped her carve a place in the world, Cleopatra did not collapse. She moved. She strengthened her army, reorganized her court, elevated Caesarion publicly as her co-ruler. She presided over religious festivals like a living goddess, bearing the headdress of Isis, invoking not just power but divine will. She understood what few of her enemies ever grasped. Symbols matter, and in Egypt, as in Rome, gods still ruled men's hearts. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the Roman Republic convulsed. Civil war tore through its provinces. Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal general, seized the east, seeking vengeance, allies, and answers. He summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus, commanded her to appear before him to explain her loyalty to Caesar, and her role in the bloody politics now tearing Rome apart. It was a summons veiled as diplomacy, but Cleopatra saw it for what it was, a stage, and she would not arrive meekly. Her barge slid up the Cydnus River like a dream made flesh, sails dyed crimson, oars of silver wood, dipping rhythmically into the water. Musicians lined the deck, playing flutes and lyres. Incense billowed from the stern, perfuming the air with cinnamon and frankincense. And at the centre of it all, reclining on a throne of gold and peacock feathers, was Cleopatra. Draped in robes that shimmered like the Nile at dusk, jewelled, poised, radiating a command that made even the most seasoned Roman soldier glance downward as she passed. Antony watched from the shore, and he smiled. If Caesar had been cold fire, calculating, imperial, abstract, then Antony was heat. He was a soldier's general, broad-shouldered, blunt, charismatic. He drank like a god and fought like a lion. He was Rome's brawler and its broken champion. And Cleopatra, she read him like a scroll. She met him not with fear, but with laughter, with riddles, with wine. She flattered his strength and gently wrapped her words around his pride. They feasted for days, nights blurred into incense and debate, theatre and philosophy, bets, dances, games, and whispered stories beneath linen canopies. It wasn't just seduction, it was alignment. She offered Antony what Rome never had, the chance to rule not as a pawn of the Senate, but as a king. Together they dreamed of a new empire, one that stretched from the Mediterranean to India. One born not of marble and republican virtue, but of silk, spice, and divine lineage. He returned with her to Egypt, and Alexandria, already a city of splendour, bloomed. Together they formed the inimitable Livers, a court of hedonism and intellect, dressed as Bacchus and Isis. They threw lavish feasts, staged mock battles on the water, drank from emerald goblets, and made wagers that startled even the most jaded nobles. But beneath the spectacle, Cleopatra governed. She revised tax policy, rebuilt the navy, brokered trade with Nubia, with Syria, with the eastern satraps of Persia. Her eye never left the map. Her hand never trembled. Twins were born, a boy and a girl, then another son, and Rome grew anxious again. The idea that a Roman general had not only allied himself with a foreign queen, but fathered royal children with her, children raised outside of Roman law, sent tremors through the heart of the Republic. Octavian, Caesar's grand-nephew and legal heir, watched with mounting fury. He claimed Antony was bewitched, that Cleopatra was a poison in the blood of Rome. He spoke of morality, of the Republic's dignity, of the need to save Antony from the clutches of an Eastern temptress. But he was not rallying Rome to rescue a friend. He was preparing for war. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony stood on the palace balcony, watching the sun bleed into the western sea. A hush lay over the city. Ships were being built in the harbour, soldiers drilled beneath the obelisks, couriers galloped through the gates, bringing whispers from Greece, from Sicily, from the Senate floor. The clouds were gathering, and yet, as always, Cleopatra stood calm. She knew how to wear a mask, how to breathe through chaos, how to play for the long game, but even she could feel it coming, the storm that would either crown her empress of the known world, or drag her into the abyss. Autumn winds stirred the waters of the Aegean. Above the scattered islands, clouds began to gather, heavy, bruised, watching. In the west, Octavian was rising. He had positioned himself as the defender of Rome, the nephew of Caesar, the restorer of tradition, and across every province he whispered the same poisonous truth, that Mark Antony no longer served the Republic, that he no longer served Rome, that he served Cleopatra, the woman, the queen, the foreigner. In 32 BC, Octavian made his move. He read aloud in the Senate Antony's private will, or claimed to. In it, Antony supposedly bequeathed Roman provinces to his and Cleopatra's children, promised to be buried beside her in Alexandria, claimed Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, was the rightful heir of Julius Caesar. The effect was nuclear. The Senate erupted, temples filled with outraged citizens, statues of Antony were torn down in rage. It was no longer a conflict between men, it was a crusade against the corruption of the East. And at its centre was Cleopatra. In Egypt she was preparing. Cleopatra gathered her navy, 200 warships gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. She marched through her barracks, speaking to Egyptian captains, mercenaries from Judea, Libyan archers, Greek tacticians. Her army was vast, her coffers deep, and by her side Antony, grim, grey-eyed, iron-jawed, called his legions to order. Their love had become something more than passion. It was a bond forged in fire, war, ambition, but ambition, when stretched too far, becomes a noose. The fleets met off the western coast of Greece, at a place called Actium. It was supposed to be a clash of titans, two great powers facing off for the soul of the world. But what followed was not glory, it was disarray. Antony's fleet, better armed but less disciplined, struggled to manoeuvre in the narrow bay. Octavian's admiral, the cunning Agrippa, pressed the advantage, outflanking, harassing, surrounding. Cleopatra watched from her flagship, eyes fixed on the chaos. And then, whether by signal, instinct, or desperation, her ships broke. She fled the battle with 60 vessels, sailing south into the open sea. And Antony followed. It was an act that shattered his command. With their leaders vanished, Antony's fleet collapsed. Roman ships burned, men drowned, officers defected, and Octavian won. Not just the battle, but the narrative. He spun the retreat as betrayal. Cleopatra, he said, had cast her spell again. She had ensnared a great Roman in cowardice. She had bewitched him. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra paced the halls of her palace, her mind racing faster than her breath. The war was lost, but the game was not yet over. She met with diplomats, envoys, priests. She sent gifts to Octavian, to Agrippa, to their wives. She proposed negotiations. She would step aside. Caesarion would inherit Egypt. Rome could have the tribute. She would retire to Thebes, or further still, to Nubia. Octavian said nothing. He was already marching. Antony, broken by defeat, abandoned by allies, slipped into despair. He wandered the gardens, sword at his side, sleepless. Gone was the soldier of Pharsalus, the lion of Gaul. In his place, a man hollowed out by fate, betrayal, and love. He received word, falsely, that Cleopatra had taken her own life. He staggered to her mausoleum, already being prepared for siege, and in a fit of anguish fell on his sword. Death did not come quickly. He bled, he writhed, and then, half dead, was carried, gasping, to her. Cleopatra received him with blood-stained hands. Their eyes met. No words, just silence, and the memory of something that might have been a kingdom. Days later, Octavian entered the city. He did not come as a liberator. He came as an executioner. He paraded through the palaces, seized the treasure vaults, posted guards at the library, the temples, the docks. He summoned Cleopatra, not to kill her, but to parade her. He wanted her alive, chained, displayed in Rome like a trophy, the Queen of the Nile, dragged behind his triumphal chariot. But Cleopatra was not made for cages. In her final days, she dressed in ceremonial robes, white linen, gold collar, lotus perfume. She visited the tomb where Antony now lay, whispering prayers to Osiris, to Isis, to the gods of the dead and the gods of old. She wrote letters to Octavian, calm, dignified. She arranged for her children's safety as best she could. And then, on a hot August night, she vanished into her chambers. In the quiet hush of those chambers, heavy with incense and fading lamplight, Cleopatra reclined on her couch, serene, composed, perhaps contemplative. At her side, a basket of figs, freshly picked, their sweet scent mingling with the aroma of myrrh. She reached into the basket with deliberate calm, her fingers brushing soft fruit and something else. A flicker, a sting. No scream, just the faintest intake of breath as the asp, nestled among the figs, struck beneath the curve of her arm. Her hand dropped the fruit. A single fig rolled across the floor. She lay still for a long moment, as if listening, waiting. The numbness began in her fingers, then crept up her arm like smoke. Her breath slowed. Her lips parted, not in fear but in finality. Whether accident, theatre, or quiet resolve, no one could say. But as her pulse faded, Cleopatra made no move to call for help. The asp slithered away. And the queen who ruled like a goddess died like a whisper, leaving only mystery in her wake. The asp, a small but deadly Egyptian viper, known for its swift paralyzing bite and potent venom. In the ancient world it was both feared and revered, a symbol of divine royalty, divine protection, and the deliverer of a quick, almost painless death. They found her body lying on a couch of woven reeds, dignified, still. Her handmaidens lay beside her, also lifeless. Octavian was furious. He had been robbed of his spectacle. He sealed the tomb, took Caesarion, took the children, took Egypt. And so ended the line of the pharaohs. 300 years of Ptolemaic rule, consumed in a single breath. Cleopatra's death was not just the end of a queen. It was the end of a world. In the centuries that followed, Cleopatra became myth, a villain in Roman histories, a temptress in Renaissance paintings, a Hollywood fantasy, all eyeliner and silk. But strip away the distortion, and you find something far more dangerous. A woman of immense intellect, a polyglot, a strategist, a scientist, a queen who ruled not through brute strength, but through elegance, charisma, and psychological precision. She outwitted generals, danced with empires, bent two of the most powerful men in history to her will, not by spell, but by sheer force of identity. She dared to rule as a woman, in a world where women were rarely allowed to rule at all, and in the end she chose her own death. Not at a man's hand, not in disgrace, but as a final act of sovereignty. We remember her as a seductress, but perhaps we should remember her as something altogether more magnificent. A strategist, a survivor, a flame, brief, brilliant, that burned in defiance of an empire. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the creative fire burning.